Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Shorts episode number 28, John Wagner. John Wagner was born in Pleasant Valley, Stormont County, Ontario, Canada, to Jacob Wagner and Hannah Anable in 1827. Like many of his uncles and cousins, he shortened his surname to Wagner. His grandfather, Jacob Sr., was a loyalist for the British Army during the Revolutionary War and was granted large tracts of land in the Cornwall-Osnabrück area for his service. John had owned the property at the time of his death in 1901. John emigrated in 1852 from Canada via California to Melbourne. During his travels, he recognised the difficulty of transport over long distances and developed a line of quality coaches and travel routes. He became a partner with Cyrus Hewitt of Hewitt and Company and later joined A.W. Robertson to form Robertson Wagner to purchase coach lines in Victoria. John was also a partner in Cobb Co, another coach line service, and held an interest in the Mount Morgan Gold Mining Company. Following the death of Robertson in 1896, John purchased several large tracts of land in New South Wales and Queensland. His hobbies were raising greyhounds and horses. On the 16th of February 1862, John married Hewitt's sister, Mary Esther Hewitt, who was born in Stonington, Connecticut, at St James's Cathedral. Mary was 12 years younger than John. In 1866, John bought a property in Melbourne, Victoria. He commissioned architect Charles de Ebro to design and build an Italianate Victorian-style 40-room mansion. He named the new residence Stonington to honour Mary Esther's birthplace. The residence was completed in 1890. After John's death, it became the temporary residence of the Lieutenant Governor and was occupied by the State Governor for 5 years. Malvern and Prahran merged in 1994 and the Victorian Government named the new city after Stonington, now spelt with a double N. The mansion is still standing and is privately owned. John and Mary Esther had 5 children: John Harrison Wagner in 1863, George Prescott Wagner in 1878, Mary Josephine Wagner, 1866, Charlotte Emma Wagner in 1868, and Hannah Elizabeth Wagner in 1869. John died at the age of 74 at Stonington following a 3-year illness. Mary had died on the 24th of December 1898 at the age of 57. His obituary reads, Mr. John Wagner, who died at his residence at Malvern on the 27th of January, was not strictly speaking a pastoralist, but he was a large owner of pastoral property and was intimately connected with pastoralists and pastoral development. He was a native of Canada, where he still, at the time of his death, owned the estate granted to his grandfather for services rendered to the Royalist side during the American War of Independence. He came to Australia via California in 1852 and brought with him a number of American wagons, which he immediately started a carrying coaching business with in Bendigo and other diggings. As manager for Hewitt and Watson and then partner in Robertson Wagner and Company, he became widely known. Robertson Wagner and Company invested their coaching profits in station properties, and in this capacity, Mr. Wagner became part owner of Paracuda and a large holder in the Mount Morgan mine. Paracuda was sold last July to Faulkner and Sons for £250,000, but Mr. Wagner at the time of his death held an interest in Gumbardo and also owned Midcan and Auburn Down stations. Mr. Wagner was a first-rate whip and a sportsman. At one time he owned a few racehorses, including Welcome Jack, and for many years his coursing kennels were celebrated. The Beechworth Ovens and Murray Advertiser on the 2nd of February 1901 also outlined his death. Mr. John Wagner, the greater part of whose life was closely associated with the development of Victoria, died on Sunday. It was while he had his coaching business in Bendigo in 1853 that he met Mr. McCulloch, the present Minister of Defence, who was then engaged in the same business, and a friendship lasted until death was founded. Mr. Wagner amassed a large fortune, and his generosity and hospitality were always commensurate with his wealth. And a little on his children. John Harrison Wagner was born on the 30th of November 1863 in Ferntree Gully in Victoria. He graduated from Trinity College at Cambridge and was admitted to the bar as a barrister in Australia in 1888. He practiced law in Melbourne, where he lived till 1897. In the Melbourne Punch on the 26th of January 1893, it says Miss Nellie Hill of Sydney, who is engaged to Jack Wagner of this city, is reputed to have £1,000 a year private income. Miss Hill frequently stays at the Australia in Sydney, and it will certainly not detract any degree from the hilarity of young Melbourne matrons. And then on the 13th of April 1893, the marriage arranged between Mr. Jack Wagner of Sydney, son of Mr. J. Wagner of St Kilda, with Miss Nellie Hill of Sydney will now not take place. He travelled extensively throughout the world before settling in New York City. He became a journalist and playwright, and he was an acquaintance of Mark Twain. The two men met in 1895 in Melbourne, and Twain provided Wagner with a letter of introduction to J. Harper, publisher of Harper's Weekly. Wagner wrote a series of articles for Harper's Weekly on the South Pacific, and he was also a literary editor for the New York Sun. He also bought and sold racehorses and trained them at Eatontown in New Jersey. He wrote a play, Mr. Wicks at Wickham, a comedy set in Australia. It played 41 performances at the Bijou Theatre in New York for 2 months in 1904. It also played in New Haven, Connecticut in September 1904. John ended his own life in his New York City apartment, the Cadillac, on the 4th of December 1904. He left no note and gave no indication that he was despondent. His body was discovered by a chambermaid. He was unmarried and had no children and had been estranged from his father. At the time of his death, he had a residence in Queensland and owned property at Auburn Station in the Burnett district. He also owned land at Gumbardo Station in the Warrego district. He held more than 14,000 shares in the Mount Morgan Gold Mining Company. His shares were valued at £6,000. He was buried in New Haven, Connecticut, in plots owned by his mother's family, and he was buried next to his aunt and uncle, William Henry Harrison Hewitt and Catherine Hewitt. Some articles that referred to his death. John Harrison Wagner, a newspaper writer who'd also done some work as a playwright, was found dead in his room at the Hotel Cadillac yesterday afternoon with a bullet wound in his temple. He was 39 years old. He came to New York about 7 years ago after practicing law at Melbourne. Mr. Wagner is said to have an unmarried sister living in Dresden and a married sister living in England. In January 1905 in the Melbourne Punch, there was a story about John Harrison Wagner, who was commonly known as Jack. The tragic end of poor Jack Wagner in America will be a shock to many of his friends. Jack Wagner once told a friend of mine how he got his first start as a journalist in New York. He'd made up his mind to earn his own living in America, and he happened to be in New York when Li Hung Chang, the Chinese statesman, arrived there on a visit. Mr. Wagner resolved to interview him and dispose of the interview to one of the New York papers. But when he reached Li Hung Chang's hotel, he found 40 irrepressible American reporters frantically endeavouring, by every ruse and dodge that ingenuity could suggest, to get a glimpse of the famous Chinese. He also found a small, well-dressed Chinese private secretary who was explaining quietly to the clamorous crowd that Li Hung Chang knew too much about the methods of American reporters to allow himself even to be seen by them. Mr. Wagner presented his card to the Chinese private secretary, expecting to meet with a similar rebuff. But when Li Hung Chang's benchman saw the card, his face changed at once, and he gave the new applicant a pleasant smile. "Are you from Australia, sir?" he asked in perfect English, and Mr. Wagner replied that he was. "A son of Mr. John Wagner of Wagner and Robertson?" he inquired again, and again Mr. Jack Wagner replied that the surname was correct. "Come right in," said the private secretary, shaking the astonished visitor warmly by the hand. "Your father did me a good turn once 20 years ago in Australia, and I've never forgotten it. I'm only too glad to be able to repay my debt of gratitude to his son now." He took Jack Wagner into Li Hung Chang's room, introduced him, and acted as an interpreter to do a fine long interview. Jack Wagner got a gigantic scoop. He had a 3-column interview which was published the next morning in a New York daily that he selected for the purpose. And none of the other dailies got anything about Li Hung Chang except what they made up themselves out of their encyclopedias. Mr. Jack Wagner leapt to the position of a successful journalist at once, and soon afterwards was invited to preside over the literary department of the New York Sun. We saw him several times when he was back in Australia recently, on a flying visit after his father's death. He always seems so bright and cheery that it is hard to think of him as a victim to that particularly American complaint of nerves. Jack received £150,000 from his father's estate. The next child was Mary Josephine Wagner, known as Josie, who was born on the 8th of August 1866 at Sandhurst in Victoria, now Bendigo. She married Arthur William Hammonds in St Kilda on the 23rd of October 1889 when she was 23 and Arthur 43. The marriage was in the paper. The marriage of Miss M.J. Wagner, eldest daughter of Mr. John Wagner of Stormont, St Kilda, with Major A.W. Hammonds, stepson of the late Mr. Justice Fellows, took place at the All Saints Church in East St Kilda. Arthur was a major in the British Army's Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry. In 1853, Arthur, with his mother and stepfather, Thomas Fellows, sailed to Australia, where Thomas Fellows became a judge. Josie and Arthur had 2 sons, one born in India and the other in England. Arthur served in Burma between 1892 and 1893 and was a recruiting officer during World War I. He became ill due to the stress of the war and passed away, and his death was listed as a war casualty. One son, Arthur, was a captain in the same regiment as his father. He earned the Military Cross for gallantry and coolness under fire during battle. He served in France and Flanders and covered the retreat from Mons whilst a scouting officer. He was killed in 1917 when an enemy mortar shell exploded in the trenches where his regiment was under heavy artillery attack. The younger son, Alexander, was a lieutenant in the British Army and a training officer. He lost his right hand and badly injured his legs when a hand grenade exploded in the trenches in France in 1915. He died in 1937 from injuries due to his war service. He married his first cousin. Josie's sister, Hannah, was his wife's mother. They had no children. Josie died on the 22nd of August 1941 in South Yarra, aged 75. The third child, Hannah Elizabeth Wagner, known as Bessie, was born on the 12th of September 1868 in Sandhurst, Victoria, Bendigo. She married Samuel McCulloch, a lawyer, in St Kilda on the 3rd of December 1890. The marriage was announced in the paper of Hannah Elizabeth Bessie Wagner, second daughter of Mr. John Wagner of Stormont, St Kilda, with Mr. Samuel McCulloch, eldest son of the Honorary William McCulloch of Woodlands near Ararat, MLC, for the Gippsland province, that took place at the All Saints Church in St Kilda on the 3rd of December. About 200 guests attended, amongst them were Sir William and Lady Clark. They made their home in Woodend, Victoria, and had 2 girls, and Bessie died on the 8th of July 1905 in Melbourne, aged only 36. Samuel McCulloch died in a shooting accident when a rifle he was carrying accidentally discharged when he was climbing a fence in 1933. Their eldest daughter, Mary Esther Wagner McCulloch, married Baron Albert Raymond Eugene Jean Almond Sedoin in London. They had one son who was born in China in 1914. It mentioned that Baron R.E. Sedoin of Brussels, member of the Belgian banking house, has large interests in Canada and China, and the Baroness Sedoin arrived at the Hotel St Francis last night after a leisurely tour of Canada. They'll remain in California for about a month and then go to Honolulu and China, and that was a year before their son was born. Mary was a novelist. An article referred to her saying she was an Australian by birth. Baroness Sedoin, who married into a Belgian family, has come back again to recover her nationality. She's been abroad for many years, living part of her time in England and part in the south of France, where she had a flat in Monte Carlo. After the outbreak of the war, she drove a car with the Anglo-American ambulance service in France, but not in the war zone, the activities of the section to which she was attached being concerned with organising voluntary services in the south. She later went to London, intending to return to France with her car, but was not permitted to go. She joined the Women's Voluntary Service in England, where workers looked after Belgian refugees. In this work, the helpers merely followed the lines laid down by the government scheme, caring for refugees after they were released from the 2 days or more immigration detainment necessary for checking up all people entering the country. Baroness Sedoin's son, Mr. John Sedoin, is of British birth and is serving in the Irish Guard. The next child was Charlotte Emma Wagner, known as Lottie, who was born on the 28th of July 1870 in Cornwall, Stormont, Ontario, Canada. Charlotte Wagner changed her name in about 1939 through a deed poll to her mother's maiden name of Avery to avoid discrimination against people with German-sounding names, as Germany geared up for the war. She died on the 6th of October 1954 in Kew, Victoria, aged 84. She did not marry. And George Prescott Wagner, known as Percy, was born on the 15th of June 1878 in St Kilda. In 1901, he's listed in the England census as feeble-minded. He suffered from severe depression and physical frailties throughout his life, and he died on the 15th of April 1913 in Eastbourne, Sussex, England. As mentioned, John Wagner became a very wealthy man, so wealthy that when his probate was issued, his Victorian estate consisted of £34,125 of real property and nearly £13,000 of personal property, and his Queensland estate was sworn in at £86,000, consisting of real property almost exclusively. Bequests of £100 each were left to 4 sisters of the testator who reside in Canada. William Yeats and Mabel Walker, 2 servants, will receive £100 and £50 respectively if they were in the employment of Mr Wagner at the time of his death. The residue of the property is divided amongst the children in equal shares.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.